I would like to say hello, maybe to New York. Vishaan, are you there?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Perfect. Thank you, Vishaan. Vishaan, just a few words to you. You are the founder and creative director of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, and author of the highly acclaimed book, A Country of Cities, a manifesto for an urban America. So that's why we invited him to share his thoughts with us about urban development. Vishaan, if it's all right with you, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon or good morning from New York, or maybe I should call it New Amsterdam in this setting. I'm going to just share my screen and maybe we can go from there. Okay, so this talk is called, it's a short talk and it's meant to just be a provocation for you. And I call it Mixed Use Futures in the Post-Pandemic City. And Andreas said, as architects and urbanists, and many of you in the real estate profession, we've been thinking about mixed use districts for a long time, especially since the writings of Jane Jacobs and others, many actually famous urbanists from your part of the world. And I think even before the pandemic, cities were changing largely because of technology. After World War II, we mainly built hub and spoke cities with this notion of a central business district. And then I think we saw emerge multiple districts where work was happening across the territory of the city. And I think increasingly, and especially with now hybrid and remote work, we see in the territory of the city many, many more places where people will work to form more of a lattice structure for our cities. And I think this has tremendous applications and implications for what we build, how we build, the infrastructure we build, and the society we create as a consequence. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this notion of the 15 or 20-minute city. The mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who's a kind of hero of mine, she's talked about this and is really implementing this across Paris, this notion that you should be able to get 80% or 85% of your daily needs in a 20-minute walk. So I think that applies to this notion of this lattice city that, if you are working in one of these nodes or living in one of these nodes, you can reach work, home, culture, recreation, and so forth in a fairly small distance, but still use the larger city for some of its larger pieces of infrastructure, the opera house, the park, the museum, the waterfront. So you're probably all familiar with that. I just wanted to set up a conversation about how buildings participate with that as an architect, in terms of both their relationship to the city and particularly the public realm and the infrastructure around them as not just mixed-use districts, but potentially mixed-use buildings. So a little bit of my background, I worked for Mayor Bloomberg after 9/11. I was the director of planning for Manhattan. And a lot of the work that you see on the upper part of this slide, the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site, the creation of the High Line was done during that period. And I learned a tremendous amount about the mixed-use district and how the forces of architecture, design, communities, and real estate work together to create mixed-use districts. And then subsequently went back to architectural practice and built a lot of mixed-use districts, including in old heritage sites. That park on the lower right is the Domino Sugar Refinery, where I continue to work today. We did a master plan for a park that's been very successful there, and it's a very interesting mixed-use district in the sense that it is, because it's built around heritage, is something that is very unique to the city and the place. It can't be a mixed-use district that can just be easily replicated around the world. And I think that's a very important feature architecturally for the future of mixed-use districts. So 7 years ago, I started my own office. It's in New York. It's actually in what I would argue, what is kind of a mixed-use building, a building built as a warehouse, not as an architecture studio. But the building had the longevity to be able to transform into these various uses. And I wish we all thought about this more. How do we design buildings not just for the use that the real estate industry sees in the first 6 or 7 years, but actually in the long-term life of the building, I think it's very important in terms of sustainability, as well as the use of the building. I also think, especially, before the pandemic, but even now, so more so after the pandemic, that, in the United States, there was this mantra that many mayors used. They said, they'd run for office and they'd say, jobs, 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 that what we care about is jobs. And I think today's young people, I think human capital today, as people come out of university, they are looking for more than that. Of course, they are looking for an economy that works for them. But I like to talk about this triangle of jobs, justice, and joy. They are looking to live in places that they consider to be just and joyful, not just places that give them an economic livelihood. And so the undercurrent of jobs, justice, and joy is this notion of there's economy in our society, equity in our society, ecology in our society, and experience, which is something that we, of course, as architects think about a great deal. And so that's a lot of the work we try to do in our office. I still believe in the city, even in the post-pandemic circumstance. The building on the lower right is the new headquarters for JP Morgan Chase. That's a collaboration our office is doing with Norman Foster's office in Manhattan. That building's under construction. Domino, the sugar refinery, the upper right image is under construction. The lower lower left is a 2,000 unit all affordable housing project in one of the poorest parts of the city. That's also just gone through approvals and is about to start construction. So I still believe in these mixed use districts, and I think they're very important. I've given talks about the fact that to build better mixed use districts, we really need to talk about affordability and ecology much more and find housing types that meet today's needs. This is a whole module I won't get into that's a carbon negative module for housing, about 3 stories, but still quite dense, that could be quite affordable and used in multiple places around the world. And then just in terms of the joy part, because I think the joy part gets not talked enough about. A project we have in the upper left, which is an expansion of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, or the upper right, which is a new observation deck in Niagara Falls, a bridge that we're designing in Indianapolis. I think joy is a very important part of what keeps and attracts human capital to our cities. And then lastly, in terms of justice, I think one of the big issues we need to confront, I think Europe is doing a much better job of this than we are, which is a question of equity, not just in terms of the kind of standard measures we use for equity, like income or race or gender, but also our streets and street equity. That, the images on the top row are New York as it exists today. A third of the city, a third of the real estate of New York City is still dominated by roads, which are then dominated by private vehicles. And I think we can imagine a different kind of city, which is the bottom row, which is a city for people. And again, I think Europe is much more advanced on this than we are, but we all have a way to go to make this transformation happen. And I think the real estate industry has a major role to play in understanding a future that is less car dependent. Okay, but now we are in this post-pandemic circumstance, and I just wanted to end with this notion, not just of mixed-use districts, but returning to this notion of a mixed-use building, and how can that be designed, not just in terms of new buildings, but existing buildings. So this is very fresh data that comes from a leading business organization in New York City, and I don't know how this would compare to where you are, but what you see on this graph is Manhattan office occupancy. The black is late October of last year. The gray is April of this year. The red is September of this year. And so what you see is that there's an increasing number of people who are coming to the office 3 days a week, and then it drops off on either side of that. And if about 55% of the people were working fully remote at the end of last year, that number's dropped to 16%. And so we are seeing our office space come back to life, but very few offices 5 days a week. My office is not there 5 days a week. We have a hybrid work schedule. I think most offices have a hybrid work schedule. And I think this is a diagram from my friend Carlo Ratti, a famous Italian professor who's at MIT, who talks about this notion of mixing within buildings, that the digital revolution actually enhances this notion of mixing within buildings. We've done a lot of studies about what it would take to create a mixed-use building from scratch. And what I mean by that is a building where you can imagine equally a family of 4 living next to a technology company, living next to a dentist's office. And what's interesting is our older cities provided these kinds of buildings and we thought nothing of it. But today, in today's financial markets, in the way we think about buildings, we think they have to be a hotel, they have to be a residential building. And what we found, and we did this at 3 different scales, a sort of small scale, a medium scale that even included some light manufacturing, and a larger scale that didn't include residential, but included a variety of different commercial and research uses. What we found in all cases is the difference are things that are, higher upfront investments in infrastructure, in higher ceiling heights, in more sound insulation, more fire proofing between uses and so forth, which of course a developer is going to respond to by saying, well, that makes the building much more expensive to build in the first instance. But I would argue that for some of these uses, and especially like if you're a university or something, the long-term value of that building is so much greater because, like my architecture office, it can transform into many different things over its life cycle. And I think that's a tremendously important thing in terms of sustainability. And then the last thing I just wanted to close on is a little study we've been doing about the future of some of our most vacant office buildings in New York City. These are neither the fancy new buildings that you see at the World Trade Center site or Hudson Yards or other places where the occupancy rates are quite high, or in buildings like mine, which are the older buildings that have been converted and have light and air and remain quite popular. But the buildings that were built in the post-war period, in the heart of our central business district, these have the highest vacancy rates of any building typology in our city. And I bet that that is true in many cities around the world. They have low ceiling heights. This is Don Draper land. And so they're very hard to rent right now for office space. And we've been doing a whole study about residential conversion, and we found a couple of interesting things. That this would require a lot of surgery to these buildings, probably tax incentives, zoning changes, building code changes. But we are trying to talk to the city about adopting those changes because we think that what this could do is bring mixed use life into our key central business district, Midtown Manhattan. It means trimming up the building, making the floor plates a little less deep, and then taking a typical floor and doing something very interesting with it, which is if we have perimeter residential that is only about 10 meters deep, because that's how far natural light will infiltrate, that these office buildings are deeper than that, that what we can provide in the heart of these floor plates is home office space. So for those workers who are working 3 days a week in the office, but then maybe 2 days a week from home, sure, those of us who have larger residences, we can find, I'm speaking to you from my bedroom where I can carve out some space. But a lot of people, young people, people who are lower income, are really struggling with this issue in terms of working from home. And so what these buildings could provide is internal workspace that's either associated with the apartment or a shared workspace in the heart of these old office buildings. And so it does something that we think is very important, which is it takes the fact that there's a lot of empty existing office space and an enormous housing demand that we have in our city and tries to marry those two. It will not be easy or cheap in the beginning, but I think over the life of the city that it'll be very important. And I believe in a world of climate change and social division that our cities are our last and best hope. So we have to continue to reinvest in them and renew them, even in the aftermath of this terrible pandemic. So thank you for listening. I hope that was interesting and a nice provocation for you to begin.
Thank you, Vishaan. Thank you very much. People are all applauding you. Thank you for sharing these thoughts.